What do you see when you look at this graph? What I see is the most common problem preventing e-commerce brands from achieving predictable, profitable growth that we encounter. Let me break this down for you. The top graph, we have 3 lines. The light blue line represents new customer revenue over time, denoted as new sales. The yellow line represents total ad spend, and the gray line represents the efficiency of that acquisition, or AMER as we like to call it, new customer revenue over ad spend. And you'll notice that the trend in the new sales line remains fairly constant, meaning that if you were to draw a trend line across it, it would be pretty even, ranging from about $7,500 to $12,500. But the yellow line has a sudden, stark decline in the amount of spend, dropping from a similar amount of money to sub $2,500. And at the same time, the efficiency has the inverse relationship. As the spend decreases, the efficiency increases. And what this illustrates is our interaction with a customer at Common Thread Collective, where they came to us basically spending at what would amount to a AMER of about less than 1. For every dollar they were spending, they were generating $1. And with some simple math, if you think about the consideration for the total variable costs associated with the fulfillment of that revenue, it's pretty easy to understand what's happening here in the second chart, which is that new customer margin, new customer contribution was negative all of the time. In other words, the acquisition of their customers were creating net negative contribution. They were generating less dollars than they were spending. Well, why do brands do this? Why is this a very, very common occurrence? And the answer is it's in pursuit of propping up a top-line revenue expectation and a lack of clarity about what's happening on first order. And the easy action that we are able to take in a lot of cases, and the solution, and in some cases without any sacrifice to the overall revenue, is that they are spending too much. That there is a massive amount of inefficiency, whether this is wasted in other channels or just in meta campaign structure, that very quickly we were able to reduce spend, create an obligation to efficiency. You can see the gray line skyrocketing to an average of closer to 2, which means that there's an obligation to first order profitability for every dollar spent. And what happens then is not only do the yellow lines begin to reach profitability most days, but the overall margin of the business grows because new customer contribution is no longer deteriorating the overall margin of the business. And this graph illustrates what I believe is the primary problem that exists in e-commerce, is net negative new customer acquisition driven by a lack of accountability to first order profitability. So today's Bridges episode is all about why the new rule of law in the e-commerce land needs to be first order profitability, how you're going to measure it, track it, and apply it in thinking about your acquisition expenses. Let's make some money. To start out, I want to anchor us in a definition of first order profitability using what I call a waterfall chart. I really enjoy this visual because it helps make really obvious what we're after, which is the ability to produce contribution margin or dollars in your pocket after a consideration for all the cost variable expenses that come out of each of your orders that you receive. So in this case, what we're illustrating is that if you have a first order revenue of $59 and you have COGS, product costs of $21, then you include all other variable expenses. And if you go back to my last episode where we break down everything that's included in cost of delivery, this is going to include your shipping and fulfillment, your merchant payment processor fees, returns, taxes if included in the first order value, all variable expenses, and then your blended cost of acquisition, all the dollars on a per order basis that go into acquiring new customers. What's left over, if any dollars at all, is referred to as first order profit. You'll often hear the phrase also first order contribution, and it is simply an attempt to illustrate how many dollars end up in your bank account after all variable expenses are paid on a per order basis. Now, the reason you don't want to include fixed expenses in this specific calculation of first order profit, and this is really important, is because fixed expenses vary in terms of their amount based on the total amount of revenue that you generate as a percentage of that overall revenue. So as an example, if I have $10,000 in fixed expenses and I receive 10,000 orders, that would be $1 per order that would need to be included in this chart. But if I receive 20,000 orders, then suddenly that percentage decreases to 50 cents. You actually can spend away from fixed expenses. And so we want to separate them out in the consideration of this process. And we want to only include the variable expenses when calculating first order profitability. Now, this visual, while a great starting point, and a starting point for this process to think about your average first order value, your average blended costs and blended cost of delivery and blended CAC is a great starting point for determining how far you presently are away from first order profitability or how first order profitable you are. The next step of this conversation is about illustrating how averages hide major problems. And so this, at the top level, we want to understand, and you can do this on a per order basis, or you can do this by looking at overall first order revenue minus all of the actual dollar expenses to determine how many raw dollars of first order contribution you're generating. Either way, it's going to give you the blended overall outcome of your new customer acquisition. And it's an important point of view to have. It's a great starting point for illustrating and thinking about what should my blended CAC be against a first order value in order to generate margin. And in this case, what it illustrates for us is that we could go up to $26 in a blended CAC and still achieve break even or first order profitability. So $25 would be the maximum new customer CAC that we could afford in order to achieve first order profitability. Now, you invert that to an AMER calculation, which is just the order value over the CAC, right? And you get roughly a 2-to-1. It's a little bit less than that in terms of the efficiency, about, whatever. Let's see real fast. Let me do some math for you. 29 divided by 20. So 59, the revenue divided by the max blended CAC would be about a 2.27 AMER that would be required in order to be first order profitable. Now that number becomes an anchor point to build your media acquisition plan against, that you can begin to decompose into a channel specific set of targets. But before we get to doing that part, to actually setting the targets into Meta and leveraging cost controls to actually ensure you're protecting against first order profitability, we need to talk about the insidiousness of averages and why it's important that you actually begin to think about order values, independent averages, in order to do this good work and protect first order profitability. Okay, to talk about averages and how they begin to be the first point at which people go wrong in their attempt to generate first order profitability. Because not everyone is out there trying to just slam past their first order margin. Some people are actually out there trying to generate it. But here's one of the reasons it becomes complicated. And it has to do with what is a very common metric for us to set targets against, which is our average order value. Okay. Remember, your average order value is a combination of purchases from the existing customers that you have, as well as new customers, across a lot of distribution of actual individual orders averaged out. And there's this great saying in mathematics that there is no one measure of central tendency that is best, but using one is certainly worst. And that's because you really need to understand what we call an AOV histogram, a distribution of order values, to think about how you should be setting your efficiency targets and what the expectations are. So this is our brand, Bamboo Earth. And if I look in the month of December and I were to think about setting a new customer acquisition target, if I were to assert our 70% margin against the average order value of the entire business, $74, and if I take a quick calculation on 30% of that, we have roughly about $50 of margin left over if I were to use that average order value. But watch what happens when I isolate this data to only show me the values of new customers. Immediately, the average is actually much higher. The new customer AOV is actually $88.98. But even that hides something really dangerous. And this distribution right here is what's called left skewed relative to the average. So if we assume the mean is here, you can see the data is distributed heavier in terms of the volume to the left of the mean. It's also sort of bimodal in the sense that there are two peaks that represent the bulk of the orders. And yet none of them are actually in the mean range. And this is where it's really important to introduce a much more common view of your order value, which is your modal order value. What is the most commonly occurring order that new customers in particular place? And in this case, you can see that the modal order value, and if we look down here at the actual bins, the count of, or the order count by bucket range. So this is just showing me how many orders occur in each of these ranges. And I could set the ranges to different dollar amounts and sort of see how this varies. And I prefer the dynamic range that gives me 10 even distributions, but you can play with that. You'll see that actually this range right here, this $39 to $56 range, represents almost 3 times as many first-time order values as any other purchase. Now, think about how dangerous this is if I'm using new customer AOV to set my CAC target, to set a bid cap, to set a cost cap. That means that most orders would be occurring at a value substantially lower. And if I were to use that, let's just say a 2-to-1 acquisition target, or my 2.27 that we were talking about before, I'm being willing to pay about $44 for this $88 in revenue. But the reality is most orders would be occurring at $56, and I would be taking a bath on that modal order value. What happens is these heavily weighted high value orders, you can see higher than 138 is actually my second most common occurring order value, is causing the average to appear much higher. There are cases, I'll use Kalo as an example. When we ran Kalo silicone wedding rings, people either bought one wedding ring for $20 or 2 wedding rings for $40. There wasn't actually a way to comprise the orders to get to what was our average order value of $30. And so if we built acquisition targets, CAC targets, or even AMER goals with the idea of using $30 and therefore a $15 CAC, what we'd be doing is making most of our orders unprofitable. So in the same way, we have to look at this now, not just on the revenue side. We can't just look at averages. We have to really understand when we're running paid media, what is the value of the funnel that I'm running? And you have to do this not just for new customer acquisition, but you really should do this by Meta, by whatever acquisition channel you're running, to look at not just the average order value, but the distribution of orders coming from the funnel that you're running. And ideally, you can isolate that range to the smallest band possible, because that allows you to appropriately actually set a CAC target or a revenue value target for those orders. This is why brands a lot of times will use locked-in landers where they have a specific offer and the customer can't deviate for it, so they can isolate exactly how much revenue they're going to be generating per order. And so this is the first part of the insidiousness of averages on the revenue side. There are different amounts of revenue that come through each order. And in order to protect first order profitability, I really actually have to understand the specificity of the order value in order to get to that profit. But it's not just the revenue where blended numbers mess you up. It's also on the margin side. Let's take a look at that. Now, this next part should be entirely obvious, but I assure you we make this mistake all the time. The reality, again, about a blended average cost of goods. So if we've already covered what happens when we use a blended average order value in setting our CAC targets or thinking about how we generate first order profitability, the same kind of problem arises when we use blended averages on the cost of goods side. And here's a very simple illustration of this problem using a real client example. If we have a pair of shorts at an MSRP of $59.50 with a cost of delivery all in of $17.39, and then we're going to assume the same cost of acquisition. So let's say we're setting up an account and we're running at a 2-to-1 ROAS, but both of these products are in that account. They're both in that campaign, and we're targeting a 2-to-1 using whatever attribution model you want. I don't really care. This isn't a point about attribution, but whatever attribution view you're using, you're getting a 2-to-1 on both of these sales. Well, in the case of the shorts, the $59.50 minus the cost of delivery at $17.39 minus the 2-to-1 ROAS or the 50% CAC at $29.75 equals $12.36 in contribution from that sale. Similarly, if I sell this dress at $99.50 minus a cost of delivery at $15.26, because you can see the dress has much higher margin, both on a percentage basis and a gross dollar basis, then when I take out my 2-to-1 CAC at $49.75, I make almost 3 times as much money. So if I were to put both of these products into the same campaign and run them at the same efficiency target, a 2-to-1, while getting wildly different variable orders, I'm going to generate 3 times as much money while making this one, but only $12.36 when making this one. And here's where it gets worse. When you optimize for lowest cost in Meta, which for most brands is the default optimization setting, you are asking Meta to not drive the highest order value, the highest margin value, but the lowest cost of acquisition. Which of these CACs is lower? Obviously, the shorts are a substantially cheaper CAC. Based on the optimization setting you are creating in the campaign, you are telling Meta that you want more of this outcome than this outcome. And this happens all the time. And in often cases, the actual margin profile makes it so that this acquisition is actually negative contributing, and this one is the positive one, but it's never getting delivery because the cost of acquisition is actually higher. You can begin to see why the setting up of specific funnels with defined order values against specific offers with a defined margin profile, a specific corresponding CAC target, and bid cap or cost control begins to be the mechanism by which you assert and create first order profitability. Because when you lump it all together and you set an efficiency target with a bunch of SKUs with variable margin and variable order value, and you output it, the blended return means that there are a lot of orders that are not profitable included in there. Now, this is all of the mechanics that begin to hide and complicate the process of first order profitability. But it's even worse than this. When we think about forecasting the overall business, I want to talk about the relationship between this first order contribution and the new customer revenue and existing customer revenue against the entirety of your P&L. In our last episode of Bridges, we talked a little bit about the relationship between your contribution margin and your operating expenses. Simply stated, if your contribution margin exceeds your OPEX, the delta between those two numbers is profit. But if your contribution margin is less than your OPEX, you will generate negative profit. So as now, if we take this idea that we discussed last time, why contribution margin is such a great signal for profitability and its relationship to OPEX, what we get out of this is an ability to start to think about how much new customer contribution margin we need to be able to generate in order to create profitability. And it begins with actually thinking about and modeling your existing customer contribution. So if we assume that most of our media spend here in this context is being used to generate new customer acquisition, and we're talking about the sort of relationship between sacrificing first order profitability, what happens is that if new customer contribution is 0 or negative, then your existing customer revenue minus all the cost of delivery associated with it, assuming even if at 0 CAC, that existing customer contribution margin has to exceed your OPEX. So in other words, you have to be profitable as a business each month on the basis of your existing customer revenue alone in order to make sacrificing first order profitability even remotely viable. And in many cases, brands are not thinking about the relationship between their existing customer revenue and their OPEX. If you want to build an e-commerce business, think about the scale of your OPEX, okay? The fixed costs of your business as scaling in relationship to your existing customer revenue. And then all of your first order contribution is all gravy. It's all where the profit gets created. But in many cases, what happens is that first order contribution is actually negative. It's deteriorating the existing customer contribution margin, and then you have virtually no chance at profitability. And so what brands need to do is they need to understand that in most of the brands, on the basis of where their OPEX sits as a percentage of revenue, they need first order revenue to contribute positive contribution in order to cover OPEX. Now, if you get smart about this and you want to grow aggressively, you have great LTV and you want to improve and you want to think about the long-term growth of the business, then the way to do that is run a lean OPEX such that the existing customer contribution exceeds your OPEX. And then you are profitable even if you are break even on first order. Now, again, it gets really hard if that first order profit deteriorates your contribution margin. But all of this, the understanding of first order profitability, how to define it, how to generate, how to structurally set it up, all relates to our ability to generate a P&L outcome. And if you as a marketer can understand these things, okay, what is my OPEX? What is the obligation that the company is on the hook for in terms of its fixed expenses? What is my modeled existing customer expectation. How does that then define the acquisition target that I need in order to generate enough first order contribution to get to profitability? Now, I know some of you are sitting there and this whole time you've been yelling, Taylor, you are not considering LTV. You are not considering how much of an impact comes from the future revenue of these customers that you generate, such that taking a loss on first order might be a great return on invested capital. That's a belief that I held for a really long time. It's kind of the model that I think a lot of the historical e-commerce businesses were based on, an LTV to CAC model. I've trumpeted LTV to CAC. It's still an important metric to consider, and there's gold standards for it. But let me show you why I think it's actually very, very rarely the case that your efficiency curve and the amount of volume of revenue that you can generate in the future warrants sacrificing first order profitability. And it comes in the form of these spend and AMER models that we build at CTC. What you're looking at now are what we call our spend and AMER models here at Common Thread Collective. They help us to understand the relationship between spend and efficiency in any given period of time for a specific business. We do this by running a regression of all of their historical relationship between spend and efficiency in different periods of time to understand the rate at which efficiency will degrade as you increase spend so that we can define the optimal budget for you in any given month. And in the process of building these models, one of the things that we wanted to look at was, well, what is the recommended budget threshold if I want to maximize first order contribution, which is denoted by the green line here. So you can see 130,000 at a 1.8 generates $40,000 based on the cost of delivery for this business, again, using Bamboo Earth, that generates this much first order contribution. And you can see that's the maximum outcome. That's the point at which on this curve here, you can see we're maximizing first order profit. But what about lifetime profit? Many businesses will want to maximize lifetime profit, right? Not just first order profit. What if I could maximize lifetime profit? Well, let me show you how small the difference actually is and how much the risk increases when you do it. So in this case, we're going to use our brand Bamboo Earth, and we're going to assume we're going to start out modestly with a 60-day LTV, which for us is about 30% increase. So we put in the percentage LTV increase that we want to model for. So this is modeling for what should I spend if I want to maximize 60-day LTV. And you'll see what it tells me is that in order to do that, I should spend an incremental $70,000, so spend $200,000 at a 1.66 to generate $330,000 in new customer revenue, so $100,000 more dollars. But in the first month, I actually make $8,000 less. So in that P&L, I'm going to make less money on that much more spend. And over the course of the lifetime, 60 days, I'll actually make an incremental $12,000. So I'm going to risk an additional $70,000 to generate an incremental $12,000, while in the short term on my P&L in that month have a worse outcome. Now, let me ask you, is that worth it? Spending $70,000 to generate an incremental $12,000? Well, some of you might say yes, and if you have enough existing customer revenue, I could see that there would be an argument for that. But here's the problem. There's no risk adjustment to this future value. So what risk adjustment would I be talking about? Well, one, cohorts tend to degrade in value as you go up and further out the customer curve. So there's a chance that the LTV could be wrong. There's also a chance that as I spend more money, my initial CAC degrades faster and is worse than I thought. There's also no consideration for the cost of capital here. There could be issues with the product. Return rate could be higher. I could be off on the margin profile. There's all these things that are calculated in the risk of the future revenue. What if I accidentally spend on those customers again in my acquisition funnel? Is the sacrifice of $70,000 against a risk-adjusted value of $12,000 worth it? I would contend for almost every brand in almost every cash position that I can think of in this moment, the answer is no. The scenario where it changes is if you have an LTV that's like, if you want to go to like a 300% LTV. Okay, so in this case, let's say you've got a brand with just really an extraordinary lifetime contribution. Okay. In this case, if you were to maximize against a 300% LTV, you can see I can spend an additional $220,000, which generates about $200,000 more first order dollars. Now look, when I do this, even with a brand with this good of LTV, I am deteriorating cash in the first month. I better have the financial wherewithal to be able to float this kind of latent value capture, right? And the end result is I make $340,000 more in lifetime contribution, whatever the period is that you generate this 300% return. So let's say it's a year, it's a brand with crazy subscription value. But every month, if I do this, every month, I'm going to be generating negative $50,000 in cash on my P&L every single month from my new customers. And it's going to take a while for my existing customers to offset that. So this is a bet on a very long-term future value capture. But unless the value is close to 300%, there's almost no scenario, even at 100%, which is what Bamboo Earth is in a year, right? Where the incremental risk, in this case, $150,000 to generate an incremental $70,000 is worth the risk of losing money in the short term and depleting my cash and creating cash risk in the business. First order profit in almost every scenario, with the only exception being extreme outliers of LTV, should be the governing policy. So the last thing here, now that we're going to talk about, I know this has been a long video and I hope you've enjoyed it, is how this affects the structure of our ad account. One of the reasons we are such huge proponents of cost controls when it comes to media buying is, one, it protects our downside of profitability for brands that cannot afford negative new customer contribution margin. And part of the other reason is it allows us for the specificity of looking at the offer that we're selling in every campaign. Every campaign in a CTC context has a specific offer, audience, and angle. But the offer has an anticipated order value that you see here. This is what we call our concept log, where we're building out campaign ideas. And you can see each individual concept has a projected AOV, a margin for that value, tells you what the break-even CPA is, where you should set your cost cap, and what the minimum budget is then to generate 50 purchases per week, and our suggested starting point for the campaign budget. Each campaign must thoughtfully consider the unique order value, the unique margin, and therefore the expected maximum CAC that you're willing to pay, the cap that you are after as a business. And when you institute this level of specificity, it gets you to a place where you can ensure that the dollars are only being spent in the event that they are generating incremental contribution. And this is really the key of this whole thing. If we go back to the starting graph, and I'm going to do that right now, dollars are not worth being spent if they are generating a false top revenue, meaning revenue that shows up in the top line, but actually deteriorates the amount of money in your bank account. And so it is better to spend no dollars at all and to capture only the organic demand that exists. You will have a healthier business than to spend money at a negative first contribution. And this is a really hard concept for people to analyze, but I hope it's the core thing that you take away from this whole thing, is that if you spend $1 and you trade $1 for less than $1, I know that sounds obvious, but this is hard for people to conceptualize. That top line revenue has not helped you. It didn't grow your business. You haven't succeeded. You have only deteriorated the amount of money in your bank account. So these cost controls with specificity of order value, specificity of margin, defining what you're selling at what value, inclusive of all the variable expenses, reconciling those constantly, is the pathway to the disciplined acquisition that you need to be doing in order to make your business grow predictably and profitably. And I get it. This can be challenging. For some of you, this may be a significant improvement, or a significant required improvement in the efficiency of your acquisition, but it's doable. There's lots of systems for it. This is just one example of the many brands that we have helped to reset their expectations for predictable, profitable growth. But it may come for many of you to a reset of the top line growth expectations of your business. But fake revenue that is propped up by non-profitable new customer contribution, is not worth keeping around. And eliminating it will create a much more healthy scenario for your business. If you've stuck around this far, I hope this is helpful. I'm going to continue to put out this long form content. We're going to get rich. It's going to be meaty and data driven, and to help marketers really understand the financial impact that they're making on the organizations that they serve, so that they can increase their authority in the organization. And as always, if you need help with this, it's what we're here to do at CTC, whether it's on a consultative basis, a tools and system basis, or as actually managing and handling your e-com. It's what we're here for. Thank you all. See you next week for Bridges episode 3.